Hi guys, Mitko here from DN Models. This video will be slightly different from the videos I usually do. Today we're gonna focus on the real aircraft instead of its model options, and only in the very end of the video I will mention some of the modeling aspects of this story. My drive to make this video came from the fact that recently I encountered quite a few articles on that same subject that brought inadequate information, and that is to put it mildly. It is quite annoying when you see or hear things that are not exact, and sometimes the mistakes are so serious that some quotations can be, with an honest heart, called lies. Such is the story about MiG-21 and its generations, and lately, due to the not so recent Bison alleged victory over a Pakistani F-16 and subsequent crashes, again involving Bison airplanes, one of them very recent, somehow MiG-21 returned to the spotlight and became favored in chewing gum for ill-educated journalists. When it comes down to aviation journalists, one should be very careful and check the validity of the information thoroughly. In some of the latest articles, I've read that MiG-21 Bison is quoted as equal, if not superior, to the early fourth generation jets, a plane so powerful that is second to none in the skies. Truly, MiG-21 is a legend, and among the Soviet planes, this is their most serious achievement of the 20th century, eventually to be superseded by the success of the Su-27 flanker family. However, the fact that MiG-21 flies today in its original and or upgraded forms does not make it competitive, but rather a gap-filling jet used by countries that haven't got the economical power to sustain expensive and reliable airplanes. So instead, they're looking back to the good old Fishbed that is working according to the standards it was designed to exist. MiG-21 is represented in three generations, not four or more, as it was quoted often. Also, if I sounded like I want to undermine the Fishbed in general so far, that was not and is not my goal. I have deep respect for that jet and I admire its longevity. I will try to be objective and honest to the maximum, and I will base this video on my personal knowledge and research on the subject. I will also try to explain everything I say with some additional information added. Hopefully that will be helpful for my subscribers who are building MiG-21s, and eventually for some people who are interested to learn more about its generations and the basic distinctive features. Let's start with the jet generations in general. All jets, I mean. As I mentioned, MiG-21 is often quoted as a second, third and a half, and sometimes even fourth generation fighter. Latter one usually when incompetent journalists or analysts are giving an example with its Bison variant. This one also is most definitely an absolute absurd. To get things very clear, MiG-21 is a second generation fighter jet similar to Mirage 3, F-104, and F-5, superior to the first supersonic jets like MiG-19 and F-100 Super Sabre, and belonging to an era dedicated to a Mach 2 plus capable planes when things were all about speed and altitude. That was the time also known as the mid-50s of the 20th century. Who to know that all this was soon to change drastically? From all those that I mentioned, Mirage 3 is the most serious achievement, then comes the F-5, MiG-21, and lastly the Starfighter. But those planes aside, we are focusing on the mix here. Let's start with the first generation of the mighty Fishbed. The first generation of MiG-21 is most famous with its F-13 model. I won't go over all the variants of the MiG-21 first gen, but have in mind that the F and then the F-13 models were the most popular and gave birth to license-built airplanes such as the Avia S-106, a checkmate F-13, and also a myriad of Chinese derivatives still in wide use to this day. There were others though. Anyhow, F-13 was a very short-range day fighter with primitive ejection seat, two pilots, and a gun that became obsolete in the first couple of years after its release. A lot of issues appeared with this model, most of them addressed later with the second and third generations MiG-21. Distinctive features of the F-13 model were the thin spine, bubble canopy. I will clear up on this a bit later. Very narrow intake and pitot tube positioned beneath the intake. Most of first-gen MiG-21s featured black cockpit layout, quite untypical for the later generations of MiGs and actually for most of the Soviet jets. The intake of that plane, despite very narrow, was restrictive. The nose cone was not fully movable, instead it had only three positions, which made the engine responsiveness unsatisfactory. Due to the wing and that altogether, the plane landed with a ridiculously high speed and was difficult to master by the pilots who flew it. Also, the size of the pilot was an issue, and some countries measured the length of the pilot's spine before they let them start the conversion training. All this was due to some eventual mishaps related to the ejection. Later on, as with all modern aircraft, the moment they became obsolete, the bar lowers for the personnel that operates it, and that was somehow forgotten. First generation MiG-21 was scaring the West at first, but then Israelis managed to trick an Iraqi pilot to defect with one F-13 and examine it thoroughly, after which gave it to the US. Look for Operation Diamond if you want to learn more. It appeared that the plane was far from sophisticated, and that was its actual beauty. It was cheap, very rugged, but to some extent it misled the analyzers because F-13 was quickly substituted by the second and then third gen MiG-21s, which were actually quite different. They could have been easily renamed to MiG-20 something else. By the way, when the plane was obtained, the F-13 I mean, second generation MiG-21s was already in use by the Soviets widely and actually by the most of the satellite countries of the Warsaw Pact. So it wasn't that big of a deal besides the shame of pilot defecting with the state-of-the-art plane. Anyhow, back to Mikoyan's design bureau, where addressing some of the issues, they came up with the second generation of MiG-21. Those are the PF, PFS, PFM, and such. Here, things get a bit trickier. This generation by itself can be divided into several subgenerations, but I won't go that deep. Let's say that if the video gains popularity and there are requests, I will make another video especially for the interceptor variants, also known as second generation MiG-21. Back to that specific plane. Let's look at it that way. There were MiG-21s without SPS system and with SPS system. This is the simplest way to present it. But more on that SPS system later. However, remember it since it is a major improvement of the Fishbed and pilots love that feature. Before and after it, those were actually two different eras in the Fishbed history. Now, The general mistake Mikoyan Design Bureau did with the second gen MiG-21 was to remove the cannon. A fighter jet without a gun is like a sniper rifle without bullets. Nevertheless, the second generation MiG-21 was designed to take off quickly, fly fast, deliver two missiles with doubtful qualities, and return home. All this under strict ground based guidance, making the pilot just a stick and throttle mover without much situational awareness and actually stripped off from its most important feature and quality, the ability to make decisions within the battle. The idea was considered good at the time, but it was abandoned quite quickly when the results started to show, and I'm talking about the two missiles only. Strategies of the missile era and the plane capabilities were combined at that time, unfortunately, in the wrong direction. With all that said, I have to add that the SPS equipped MiG-21s of the second generation are adored by Fishbed pilots and are considered the best balance within the whole family. The plane was fast, nimble, and flew actually quite high. I won't go into every little variant here, but let's start with the general ones in the PF, which featured a bubble-like canopy, enlarged spine behind the cockpit, up to the middle of the spine, and then a narrow vertical fin, close in appearance to the F-13. I will be quick here to correct myself because the canopy wasn't exactly bubble like F-16 if you imagine that, but it featured front armored shield. But for its time and lack of side frames, this was an improvement in general, considering MiG-19 and MiG-17, and especially considering the cockpit of the Fishbed and how narrow and deep the pilot seated inside of it. This was a thing and a little bit helpful. The ejection seat itself was designed to be used altogether with this same canopy, which served as a shield in the first moment after ejection to protect the pilot, but also caused some delay to the whole sequence. That made the ejection without altitude and speed lethal and restricted the ejection seat usage in some of the most critical phases of the flight, especially for a single-engine jet, were uncovered. Imagine yourself pulling the handles and find yourself behind the glass with the seat attached to you for the first few moments, a glass coffin of a kind. Quite a thrill, wouldn't you say? Being a pure interceptor, this plane was equipped with a radar, and its visor took a central place in the cockpit dashboard, where a pilot should focus his attention mostly. That made this whole thing even more exotic, to say the least. The plane, still suffering from the very high takeoff and landing speed, was inappropriate for young pilots coming from planes like MiG-15, MiG-17, or even MiG-19. And to put it mildly, MiG-21 was demanding. Mikoyan learned the lesson and introduced some improvements within that second generation. Most important one was the SPS, meaning Zduf Pogranicznego Slaya, translated into boundary layer control. The upper surfaces of the flaps were blown with some bleed air from the compressor. That lowered the landing speed significantly and eased up pilots' workload. All the guys I know who flew with and without the SPS loved the upgraded version of the plane and loved it with all their hearts. The nose cone, unlike the first gen, was fully movable here too. That was thanks to a couple of sensors forward and aft of the compressor that controlled the proper aperture of the intake. This helped with engine responsiveness to some extent, and in generally helps to widens and smoothens the envelope of the working process of the jet engine. Those features were embedded in the PFS variant, and here comes the cocktail of external details that can confuse even the experts. But overall, all this quickly translated itself into MiG-21 PFM, a version that was with better ejection seat, canopy that was hinged and open to one of the sides, and SPS embedded from the get-go. This is the ultimate second generation MiG-21. PFM перехватчик, форсированный, модернизированный, meaning interceptor upgraded, that is for the engine, and modernized. The canopy was a major improvement in terms of pilot security because the whole shield idea from the previous variants was now abandoned, given more acceptable ejection characteristics. Unfortunately, with the jets from the 50s, 60s, and even 70s, especially single-engine ones, safety wasn't that great, and such improvements were warmly welcomed. With the PFM comes the wider chord vertical stabilizer. However, it was seen on some PFSs too, but let's not go deep into that rabbit hole because you will lose the trace eventually. The cocktail there is confusing. This was an important feature because it improved directional stability and made the plane even more distinctive. A small cone holding the braking parachute is located in the root, and that makes the MiG-21 easier to be distinguished from the other variants of the second generation. On some PFSs that was there too, and it was quite tricky to distinguish them from one another. However, the PFM, as I've said, is considered the best of that second generation, and many think that this is the most beautiful MiG-21 ever to be made. That was, again, according to weight to trust and visual appearance, stuff like that. But in general, whoever flew PFM fell in love with it. It was a relatively successful airplane, proven in Vietnam War, although it lacked a cannon and had only 2 underwing pylons. Latter one was addressed to some extent using double pylons, holding 1 pylon and 2 rockets underneath on the second one, but that wasn't a very serious approach to the issue anyhow, and it never solved the problem with the lack of the gun. However, that too was solved in some PFM variants with the underbody gun pot, but that brought a lot of drag with it too, so it wasn't a good idea in general. The second generation, and especially the PFMs, are famous with the name the Dove of Peace because of its modest armament. The plane and its name came mostly in Eastern Europe, and if I am not wrong, the original nickname came from Bulgarian pilots who flew it. Nevertheless, from those same guys, I know that this is actually the fastest and the highest flying MiG of them all. I mean, from the 21 family, of course. And I prefer to trust their words instead of what is written in the books. It is all relative, but all they say is that this was the greatest MiG-21 to fly if you have to pick one of the options. Again, lessons learned, and then enters the third generation MiG-21. Let's define what is specific for the third generation of the Fishbed. Different spine for wing pylons, different cockpit layout, multi-role capabilities. The latter one is the most important, and this is what defines the differences. Now, let's dig deeper here, so to make my point about Fishbed's generations clearer. First generations was a day fighter with 2 missiles and a cannon, pretty restrictive weather-wise. Second generations was all-weather interceptor variants without cannons and only with two pylons, a bomber. Although some PFMs were used to shoot unguided rockets and stuff like that, it never was a multi-role jet, and it didn't mean that they were any good at it. The plane was simply designed to do another thing, so pure interceptor and end of the story. Here comes the third generation. The M, SM, /MF, SMT, and BIS. I purposefully won't mention our version because it is not part of the main line of MiGs. It is, but it is not that significant nor popular. Now, the third generations were different in appearance and were all aircraft that were used very differently depending on the operator, and in general, they can be considered really multi-role planes. They all featured large spine, where more fuel was embedded, canopy similar to the PFM, open to one of the sides, and wide chord vertical stabilizer. They all had 4 underwing pylons, better radars, and more powerful engines, of course. Also, they had the SPS system embedded, as you might have guessed. If you look only the nose part, the pitot tube of the second gen was centered in the middle, while here with the third generation is put to one of the sides. Slightly, but it is visible. You can distinguish them from that. From the outside, though, it is hard to make the difference between them, with minor exceptions. Let's start with the M. You can tell at first glance it is an M version from the periscope on the cockpit, which is usually not there with the M. I say usually because they were exceptions. There you can use a little hint eventually. The additional intake doors in front of the leading edge of the wings either feature streaks or don't. If there are no streaks, well, we're talking M variant most likely, periscope or not. But in general, they were missing the streaks and missing the periscope altogether. SM and MF are indistinguishable from one another. The main difference is that the SM was made for the Soviets and the MF was the export version. Usually, there are tips and tricks to tell one from the other, but in this case, I have nothing on my mind to share with you, and maybe someone could hint me in the comments down below. Insignia is not what I mean either. But this is one of the options. MF wasn't used from the Soviets and SM wasn't used from anyone else but them. So in some cases, you can tell looking at the markings. Now, MF was done from a couple of factories, if I remember correctly, and there were differences from the outside, and those, even though small, were noted by the staff that work on that plane. I cannot be very precise nor specific on that matter, unfortunately. I've heard it only. There is one significant difference in between the MF types that I know of, and this is the cockpit. There is the MF cockpit, and there is a cockpit similar to the BIS variant, also seen in the MF. That MF was known as MF-75 in Warsaw Pact countries. So, if you model this, be careful and count on reference pictures more than anything else. There is an MF with the MF cockpit, and there is one with the BIS cockpit. Simple as that. Remember that. Then comes the most distinguishable MiG-21 of the third generations, and this is one of my favorites, the SMT. This is the SM with the T that goes for Toplivo, meaning fuel. This is a Hulk in MiG-21's world and looks like a deformed overdose on steroids plane that was hated by its pilots. You can tell the difference from the huge spine tank, which made it quite sluggish in flight and difficult to master. It was messing with the airflow to a large extent, so much so that this crippled the capabilities of the variant. Unfortunately, not many pictures of it are available on the web, especially compared to the other variants. SMT was used by the Soviets mostly, and it was quickly substituted for an option with the smaller spine. The SMT is also the easiest one to spot. It is very, very ugly, and I personally love it for that. Now, to the trickiest part, the mighty BIS, the plane that is considered the best version of the MiG-21, at least from those who love to read about it. Not so much by the ones who flew it. This plane is hardly distinguishable for the naked eye, but featured some differences. This plane is also third generation MiG-21 and not fourth, and I will tell you more next. This featured improved parts, meaning that some of the materials used were substituted for lighter ones with better stiffness allegedly. That way, some of the elements kept their form and size, but was made from different alloys. The cockpit, as we mentioned, was similar to MF-75, so no major differences there. Some equipment mostly, but nothing overly significant. However, the intake was slightly larger and, to be exact, 22 millimeters larger in diameter compared to the MF. The spine also was larger to accommodate additional fuel that the plane was advertised to carry. However, the upgraded engine, although more powerful, was more thirsty as well, so the improvement was insignificant in that regards. Actually, it is basically the same engine as the SMMF with additional fuel pump and probably other minor alterations that gave it more power, and something that was called Chirezvichayny thrust, meaning abnormal thrust. That was something like an emergency thrust that could be used to avoid potentially deadly situation. Older generation of A320 pilots probably remembered the bump button on the throttles. This was sort of the same. You don't use to keep the engine safe. You use it to, well, if you happen to be in a situation where your life depends on it. If you happen to use it and you don't have a decent excuse, you are in trouble because you will make a lot of work for the ground guys. Expensive one, probably. The MF engine was R13 and the BIS was R25, but despite the huge gap in the numbers, the engines were built on the same basis. So the differences, both engine-wise and airframe-wise, wasn't that deep to call the BIS a fourth generation MiG-21 when compared to MF. BIS was made to exploit the airframe to the very last drop, and for the time being it almost did. Later on, the Lancer and the Bison packages did that even better, but this was the last real production variant of the Fishbed, so the upgrade packages does not count. Back to the front of the plane, the difference in the intake diameter compared to the MF is hardly noticeable, and we already said with what the other improvements were. There were minor ones like the autopilot, but if we compare, let's say, M variant to the SMT, you will see much wider visual difference than if we compare BIS and MF. That is why, again, BIS cannot be considered another generation of MiG-21. Differences were not so deep. Pilots loved it, but all of the ones I spoke with told me that it was sluggish compared to the MF, and the pleasure of flying was kind of lost while the improvements themselves didn't worth the effort. And I'm talking about men who flew both MF options and both BIS variants. Most of them also flew the PFMs. Uh, you can look that up if you'd like. I'm talking about four options mostly: two MFs, MF and MF-75, and two BIS SAU and BIS Lazur. Nevertheless, this was the very last MiG-21 and produced up until 1983, when it was far beyond obsolete, but still very cheap. Many of it are still flying to this day. Go figure. Now, the last improvement of the airframe, Bison and Lancer, those were aftermarket packages. Lancer is a joint venture between Romania and Israel, an upgraded MF, and also twin-seaters, but let's focus on the MF, while Bison is really a MiG-21-93, a brainchild of Mikoyan Design Bureau. None of them is another generation of MiG-21, nor, as I've seen quotes, it is third-generation jet fighter. Third-generation jet fighters are swing-wing jets. I even saw an idiot that said that the Bison was fourth-generation jet. None of that bullshit. These two were upgrade packages, both bringing up the good old Fishbed to acceptable modern standards, improving its original situational awareness, which was mediocre, to say the least, to an up-to-date standards. It was like that from the get-go. The MiG-21 was with poor situational awareness, and the giant leaps in electronics allowed for this to happen later on in the service life via Lancer and Bison. Those were acceptable upgrades to some extent. Lancers fly quite often in Romania, and Bisons are flying and falling out of the sky every now and then in India. To be exact, Bison is a deeper mod compared to the Lancer, most distinguishable from its semi-bubble canopy, similar to MiG-29. Improved radar, widened armament, and such. However, same engine, same old BIS. The real attempt to really boost MiG-21 came from Mikoyan a couple years after MiG-21 93 in the face of MiG-21 97, and that was featuring MiG-29 engine. However, that never really happened. And if it were to happen, if we consider that engine as a suit factory, if we take a look at the fulcrum, it would have been useless. So, in conclusion, there is no fourth generation MiG-21. There are only three. This might help you distinguish them, and you can also do your own research and maybe find something to ruin my statement. I would be actually happy to learn more. I've spent almost 2 years of my life flying next to a base that was using MFs and BISs, and I have very deep respect for this plane. One of the true scaring airplanes like Starfighter and first variants of the MiG-21s. And I will conclude the video with the modeling aspect. If you want to build a modern first-gen MiG-21, you better forget about it. There is the trumpeter kit, which isn't serious, isn't up to date, and you probably won't enjoy it. It is in 48 scale. In 72nd, there is Revell, and I am not sure about it, to be honest, but from what I've heard, is far from special. Second and third generation MiGs are a different story, both in 72nd and 48 scale. They are covered by Edward, and they are very close to perfection. Exclusion to that is the BIS, which needs a different intake. The whole nose section is available in resin, if I'm not mistaken. Even though in 48 scale, the difference is half of the millimeter. But with that said, trust me, you can tell. Not sure about the proper width of their spine, but in general, even though not exactly correct, their BIS is fairly accurate and out of the box is quite nice. If you want to do anything but BIS, you're good to go with your kits. PF, PFMs, MF, SMT, and such. As for the Lancer and the Bison, well, you can eventually build them over Edward kit, but of course not out of the box, which with MiG-21 93 aka Bison is a mystery to me why the Czech company haven't approached the subject yet. This shouldn't be an issue for them, and India is beyond huge market. The same question arises for the first generation MiG-21 since Czech made it locally under the name S-106. Edward being a Czech company and not offering that, real bummer. I hope they will listen and will change that. We need Edward first generation MiG-21. We desperately need that. In 30-second scale, there are trumpeter kits, which in terms of accuracy and shape are a holy ridiculousness. So forget about those two. Now, this was quite different from my standard pattern, but I hope you will find it useful and interesting. Maybe, if the subject intrigues you, I can do more on that. I have very interesting information about MiG-21 trials, comparisons with different jets, including MiG-23, and some facts that are rather surprising. Also, with that comes a bunch of bullshit written from the journalists that are a good basis for a fun conversation on the Fishbed subject. In the meantime, check out some videos available on YouTube. Those show how rugged this plane was. There are examples of PF, PFMs, and MFs taking off and landing on grass. Some nice maneuvers from different air forces, mainly Czechs and such. You can enjoy a lot if you look thoroughly. You can probably get some inspiration to build one of the kits too. I hope you liked the video, even though a bit aside from modeling, and you will find it eventually useful. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.